All right, welcome back. Mr. Brownell, or sorry, Ms. Young, did you want to do a final question for growth and conservation framework?
I had one more very specific question, and that was the PSA extension on 108 and Tridelphia Road and Frederick Road. So that PSA extension on 108 near the Board of Education, what are you looking at the fire station side? Are you looking behind ARL? Where and why did you identify that piece of property as opposed to some other piece? I mean, there's only two PSA extensions, so I did actually pay a lot of attention to that map, and I'm wondering where those two properties are. And no, Sarah, you look like the person to answer. You knew where all those activity centers were. Maybe you can also.
If you want to speak to the location, but that was a request from the Howard County Public School System, was to move that their property, which is on
their property.
It's their property,
Oh,
correct?
okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I thought it was
And
like
it's their
some sort of
property.
development that was going to take place
No. And
around that property.
I don't know that they have specific plans for it at this time, or at least they didn't articulate those to us, but I think that they wanted to have flexibility in the future should they need to use it for additional office buildings or whatever.
So the Board of Ed right now, the building where they're located right now, doesn't have public sewer and water, or it does just to that building?
It's behind it. So the property is just behind the Board of Ed at Homewood and 108. And, it's, the building just behind it has public water and sewer, but they requested the parcel just behind it.
So Homewood does too. It has to. It's a high school.
Yes.
Right,
Yep.
okay.
So it's adjacent to,
All right. And then the fire station that's going to go in, that would have to have water,
Right.
obviously, would have to have water and sewer. So it's a piece that would go over there that they might be able to put another office building.
yes.
That's a good idea, actually. Get them all in one place. Okay, and the other one on Tridelphia and Frederick Road. Do you know what is that something
It's
that's?
the current Fox and Barrel restaurant, then they're asking to just be connected to the water sewer service only.
And it's nearby.
Yeah,
I mean, it's near
Right.
a water main that
Correct.
already exists, and they're asking for.
it's right along the boundary.
Well, okay, that is, when I asked
they need it
you
for the
last
restaurant.
week about specificity, I have to say that is as specific, I think, as a general plan can get. So, all right, thanks.
And just can I ask a quick question on that? That isn't there a fire hydrant already on that side of the road where that restaurant is? I think that there's a.
That specific, I don't
Okay, now,
know.
Okay, too
this is a
specific.
real
Never mind,
test.
never mind. I
How
want to get to fiscal.
specific can you guys
Are
get?
you aware of the existence of a fire hydrant?
I think we've already brought the water under the road. It's just not branched out to the, sorry.
You know, we appreciate it, and I think we'll all be on the lookout for that fire hydrant for next time. Mr. Brownell, if you'd like to begin with your fiscal analysis.
Sure, thank you.
presentation.
Good afternoon, council members. So this is a presentation on the fiscal impact study that we did, and it summarizes the fiscal impacts for the hybrid scenario that was presented, earlier this morning. So basically, we developed the fiscal impact analysis in conjunction with the budget office. And Holly Sun is also with us, I think, online as questions come up. So I appreciate Holly being with us. We worked very closely with the budget office to come up with this analysis. The purpose of the fiscal impact analysis is to inform HOCO by design. Just want to point out that the fiscal impact analysis is not intended to be adopted as part of HOCO by design. It's really a tool to inform HOCO by design. And it's a tool to use for scenario testing and sensitivity analysis testing, and it shouldn't be considered to be a definitive budget projection model. So you'll see in the analysis there's very specific numbers, but it's really meant to look at the fiscal impacts of new growth and to be able to explore various scenarios that were discussed this morning, and also to look at sensitivity analysis testing. And I'll talk about that as the presentation continues. We worked with the Spending Affordability Advisory Committee on much of this sensitivity analysis testing. And so we met with the Spending Affordability Advisory Committee 4 times last December and January. Spent a considerable amount of time presenting the analysis to them and working with them to come up with some various alternatives and assumptions. And we did that. And the value really is based on looking at the relative differential of those assumptions. For example, what if you change the mortgage rate? What happens to the fiscal impacts? Things of that nature. And so we looked at with the SAC. And the SAC prepared, the Spending Affordability Advisory Committee, prepared a report on the fiscal analysis in January 2023. And the SAC found the fiscal analysis solid in both methodology and results. That middle bullet point shows some suggested alternative scenario tests be run, and I'll talk about those a little later in the presentations, but basically you can see those 5 items that we decided to adjust to see the relative impacts of those things. The SAC, and this comes from the report, you see the quote there, believes the methodology and assumptions of the revised fiscal impact analysis are reasonable and the results showing significant positive net fiscal gains from the projected new development are valid. So I really appreciate the SAC's input. There are the few economists in the SAC, and we really dove into the details with them. They were very helpful and provided a lot of good guidance. So what is a fiscal impact analysis? A fiscal impact analysis measures the cost and revenues to the public sector. So it's really an analysis of the county's budget. It's not a market study, which we talked about earlier. It's not a financial feasibility study, which looks at the financial feasibility of developing a site, for example. It's not an economic impact study. You often see economic impact studies which measure the impact of development on the broader economy in terms of the number of jobs produced and in terms of the impact in the broader economy. It's really looking at the budget of the jurisdiction, whether it's city or county. It's important to note, so we use current levels of service, and so you'll see that the basis of it is the latest adopted budget, the FY23 budget that was adopted last July, in July 2022. So we start with that basis, so we have the latest and greatest budget situation for the county, and we utilize the existing population as of July 2022 and the jobs, and looking at the current levels of service that are provided, assuming those levels of service stays the same, what does the fiscal impacts of new growth look like moving forward? So a certain park ratio, for example, certain police officers per capita. It doesn't assume that we change the level of service, it just keeps it the same, just to get an idea of how that would work moving forward based on new growth. It's also a marginal analysis, meaning that it looks at the fiscal impacts of new growth only. So it's really measuring the costs of new growth and the revenues from new growth, and what's the cost versus revenues for new growth moving forward based on the hybrid analysis that was talked about earlier. And it's an 18-year plan, so the general plan talks about 20 years, so just for purposes, you'll see some number differences, and the main reason for that is because since we started this, we wanted to use the latest budget, FY23. We started with 2022 as the base number, so we go from 2022 to 2040 in this updated fiscal analysis. We had started this analysis when we started the general plan a few years ago, and at that point we used an earlier budget. And then we updated to the latest budget before we met with the SAC this fall to make sure that we had the most up-to-date information. So it's an 18-year analysis. So here's a review of some of the growth assumptions. And you've seen this before. This was the flume. So it's the hybrid analysis that comes in HOCO by design. So the draft HOCO by design that you see before you and the HOCO by design that the planning board reviewed and recommended is based on the future land use map. We also did fiscal analysis scenarios that Sarah alluded to before last year, and might have been the year before, where we met with the Planning Advisory Committee and did fiscal impact analyses on those 4 growth scenarios to show the relative impacts of those. And we have all that documented in the HOCO by Design website under Scenario Planning Guide. We did that last year, and we updated the model based on the current budget year, and then looked at the hybrid scenario to project these numbers here in the fiscal analysis. And we talked about this chart at length before. And I would just say that the blue really is the potential impact from the flume. It's not the definitive impact, but basically the intent of the flume is to potentially add more capacity in the activity centers and all the things we talked about before. So the demand, for example, of jobs, as we mentioned, we talked about 59,000 jobs. The existing capacity is around 28,000 jobs. The future capacity under the hybrid scenario could be as high as 35,000 jobs under the flume. The same with housing. You know, the demand was 31,000 from the HCPSS market study. The existing capacity in the county is 15,200. It's important to note that that number, 15,200, does not include redevelopment potential that currently exists. The TOD zoning along Route 1, for example, has potential redevelopment. So the existing capacity is actually a little higher than the 15,200, but still it's not at the level of the demand of 31,000, let alone the 20,000 that we talked about before, which is the pent-up demand for housing. So the future capacity under the flume is the 27,000 under the hybrid scenario as a potential. And again, the details would be what happens when the comprehensive rezoning, right? We talked about that also. Once the comprehensive rezoning is in place, that would really, dictate the specific capacity that may be developed under the concepts put forth in the general plan. Just to highlight again, this does not include Gateway. And as expressed, the Gateway Master Plan is going to take place. And the intent of not putting the numbers for Gateway now is we wanted the master plan to be, that process to be gone through, to make sure all the infrastructure for such a large plan for Gateway is in place and that the master planning process takes forward. So the good news about Gateway, which is a prime redevelopment site in the county, is that that could be used to meet this gap there. It could be used to create even more jobs and more housing over the blue there. And it would be in that very important activity center and well planned for with all the infrastructure needs met. For example, you could put a high school site or a middle school site on the Gateway site. So the demand could potentially be met, through Gateway. And of course, that's a very long-term plan. Downtown Columbia was adopted in 2010. It's about maybe a third of the way through. It's a 30-year plan. Gateway could be 30, 40-year plan. So something to kind of continually think about, that this is really a long-term plan with a long-term horizon. It's a 20-year plan, but, Gateway would clearly be longer than 20 years. So this is the numbers in the fiscal impact analysis. And so because it's an 18-year plan, it's 25,000 units rounded. And that's about, 27,000 units over 20 years. And you can see, based on the flume, as an estimate, we had about half of those units are rentals and condos. And the assumption used in the fiscal was that the condos were 10%. In other words, between the rentals and the condos, we just assumed about 10% condos. That could be changed, right? That was just a variable used in the fiscal impact. What we're finding really is most housing currently is rental apartments and less condos. But you could do a scenario to determine, what that would be. Both rentals and condos, for example, typically have the same household size because they're smaller units. You can see that most of the high-density housing is in Columbia, which clearly is downtown Columbia and potentially some in the village centers and potentially some along the Stoughton Gateway area. Basically, one of the scenarios that the flume, comes from the flume. So that's what's used in the hybrid scenario for housing. And I wanted to do a brief segue just to kind of provide context on these numbers. I thought it might be helpful. And so this is sort of the historical building permits in Howard County. So in the 80s, there was about 3,000 units built per year. And so that was a lot of units built. And it's interesting, there weren't a lot of schools built in the 80s. And for some reason, if you look at the history of when schools were built, I don't know why that is, but there was a gap for about 5 years where schools weren't keeping up with demand. And there was a big problem. And so that's when the 1990 general plan was adopted, and the major policy in the 90 plan was to call for APFO. So APFO was adopted in 1992, and then after the adoption of the 1990 general plan and APFO, the number of units were reduced through the managed growth process to about 2,000 a year. And then in the 2000 general plan, which was adopted, I think, in November 2000, a new Apfo chart was part of that plan, and it was a conscious decision to drop the units to 1,500 units per year. And Apfo worked. We had about 1,500 building permits a year for that decade, giving time for infrastructure to be managed and schools to be built and to put growth on hold, housing on hold during this period of high demand, during this time period. So this chart shows basically the left half is the same 10-year period as before to 2010, and then it adds the last 12 years to 2022. So in between that time, of course, Plan Howard 2030 was adopted, 2012, I think. Downtown Columbia Plan was adopted in 2010, so we added more capacity. But the average building permits per year have been about 1,500 units per year for the last 2 decades. And I did want to show the 1,300-year average, which is the last 5 or 6 years, really to show that growth is slowing. And based on leading indicators, it's going to continue to slow, primarily because we don't have a lot of land left in Howard County, right? So it's sort of a natural thing that would happen, plus a stricter APFO that occurred. So if you look at what's in the pipeline, we're expecting growth to slow into the next 5 years. And of course, with the change in the zoning, it might allow for more capacity, and that might change things a little bit. This chart is the same exact chart, but it highlights by unit type. And the main point of this is to indicate that the number of single-family detached homes has decreased generally over time as the zoned land for those homes has been declining. And then with the adoption of the Downtown Columbia Plan, some of the implementation of the TOD and the CAC areas along the Route 1 corridor and other mixed-use activities, we've had more apartment units built. And you kind of see those red spikes because not every year are apartment units permitted, but when they are permitted, they tend to have a lot of units. So, for example, the one that was permitted in 2021, I think, includes the large one, Marlowe, in downtown Columbia, which is one of the biggest apartment units we've had in Howard County, 472 units. So it's going in a place that it was planned for. You'll see that happen, but in general, I think growth will slow down. You can see the single-family detached is continuing to slow down. So going to non-residential, this is the non-residential projections. That Flume chart showed 35,000 jobs, and this equates to 31,500 over 18 years, taking the 2 years away from the 20 years. And most of the jobs are in Columbia, where part of the downtown plan. And they're mostly, hot A-B office space, which is, sort of 4, 5, 6-story office buildings, not really the BC flex space below. But you can see, based on the Flume, this is a scenario that we came up in terms of where those jobs could be located. This is, I mentioned this before during the question and answer. So this is a historical job growth of about 3,000 jobs per year over the last couple decades. You see the little dip there due to COVID in 2020. And it's interesting that we actually have less jobs in Howard County, according to BEA, than we had in 2018 still. So jobs are increasing, but they're coming back relatively slowly. But the demand, as we mentioned, was 59,000 jobs. It's about 3,000 a year for 20 years. If the pace of the last 20 years continued, then we would meet that demand. But because of the limited capacity, we're expecting to have less jobs. And the general plan is projecting about 1,700 jobs per year. Part of that also is in the decade of 2000s, we had the base realignment and closure, which was a big economic impact in Howard County. It related to the Fort Meade realignment, and it included Fort Meade growth, and Howard County actually benefited from that. There's a lot of ancillary jobs and high-tech sort of jobs related to the work done at Fort Meade and MSA. So there was a demand for jobs. That pretty much has finished. There is still Fort Meade growth activity, but a lot of the job demand that occurred in the last decade isn't there like it had been before. So there's still strong demand. There's also a big question, we talked about this with a SAC, what is the future of office, right, with telework? And so you'll see a little later how we kind of looked at that scenario. So between the limited amount of land left and these changes in the market, it's very likely that the next 20 years aren't going to see the same 3,000 jobs per year. So we built that into the fiscal impact analysis. One way to look at the fiscal impact analysis, it tries to look at things if you can try to be realistic, as much as we can be realistic in future, recognizing that there's a strong demand. And so, for example, if Gateway Master Plan gets adopted and there's the demand for 59,000 units, then it could be that we do achieve the 3,000 jobs per year over the next 20 years. So it's just something that we think about as we go forward. This slide came up before, I think, in this presentation or the previous, in this presentation, last week. So I wanted to bring this up again because it's really important just to keep in mind. And we all know this, but government is just only one of 5 pieces of the puzzle, right? You have to have willing property owners that want to be developed. You have to have a market demand, which we talked about earlier. There is a market demand. Howard County is located in a pretty vibrant region. There's a market demand in the Baltimore region in general, similar to the Washington region. So when we think of demand, it's not just Howard County, it's the region. So that's important to keep in mind. Given Howard County's location, clearly there's going to be a big demand in Howard County. A lot of potential future change possible in Howard County. So you have the government, willing property owners, government sets the policies, regulations, the zoning, et cetera. Just one role, and then of course you need developers and the lending community. So all these pieces need to be put together when we go forward. That's why we say the fiscal impact analysis isn't a budget projection tool because there's so many unknowns, right? It's a tool to kind of look at. So looking at all of this as a background, what are the net fiscal impacts of growth? So this is the hybrid scenario, and this is a lot of numbers in this chart, but basically over 18 years, if you take all of the costs that were calculated in the fiscal model for new growth, and we'll get into that in a little bit more detail, minus all of the revenues minus all the costs, you end up with a net positive $59 million in year one, or I'm sorry, average annual. In year one, I'm jumping ahead of myself. So the $58 million, I wanted to highlight here that most of the revenues are from property tax and from the fire tax, which is a property tax also. The fire tax is the property tax. We included the general fund and the fire fund as well. And also income taxes. So 90% of the revenues are property tax and income tax. There's also a fair amount of capital revenues that we call them. And I have more slides showing the details of these further on, but these are one-time charges paid for by new development. So when you build a new house, you have to pay a school excise tax and a road excise tax and transfer taxes. And so those homes actually produce a lot of income for the county each year. And you can see the number there relative to the other numbers. Major costs, as we know, is the public school system of $57 million, followed by public safety, police and fire, $36 million. And the capital costs are all included. So this includes both operating costs and capital costs, including pay-as-you-go and also debt service moving forward. The biggest capital cost is the Howard County Public School System. That's the average annual over 18 years. In year one, the very first year of the new growth in the hybrid would generate net positive fiscal impacts of close to $30 million. And in year 18, it's $96 million. So basically, as you add more growth, the more the positive fiscal impacts, because new growth pays for itself and generates net positive revenues. And then we'll talk about why that is later on also. So over the 18 years, kind of in summary, it's a net positive impact of about $1.06 billion. So this is basically not just revenues, but it's additional revenues over costs that come into the county's budget over the 18-year timeframe. This is nothing new, the fact that new growth pays for itself. It's the way the budget in the county is structured, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But if you do there's been fiscal impact studies done by other consultants in Howard County, other general plans, Downtown Columbia Plan, other counties, Anne Arundel County, et cetera. And in Maryland, the way the tax structure is, and we'll talk about that in a second, new growth does generate positive net fiscal impacts to the county. So what are some of the methodologies? We have a document called the Cost and Revenue Assumptions Methodology Document that is on the website, and we tried to develop that to be as open as possible and to clearly lay out things clearly so that people can see exactly what goes into the model. The intention is not to be a black box. It has a lot of assumptions, and working with the SAC, we changed some of those assumptions to see what the impact would be, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So as a kind of a summary of the budget, this is the FY23 budget. It's $1.3 billion was approved last July. Just note, it doesn't include the prior year use of funds, which are one-time revenues. So it's not an exact match to the budget, but the one-time prior year use of funds, we don't want to project those forward because they're not intended to be, they're not part of the base budget. So this is the general fund. Let me go back here. Yeah, so that's most of the revenues are property and income taxes. 90% of the revenues are property and income taxes. You can see the other ones fall below that. The third highest is recordation taxes, and that's only 2.3 of the budget. The greatest cost, 63% of the budget, is education, $810,000, followed by public safety, and then public facilities, which includes public works and DPZ and soil conservation. So diving into a little bit more of a detail, so I mentioned this. So property and income tax comprise about 90% of the revenues total that comes in the general fund. Also important, we did look at the fire assessment. So we did look at the fire fund. So the fire fund is $152 million compared to the $1.29 million for the general fund. And the revenues for the fire fund come from a property tax on property tax bills. So this is the result of the fiscal analysis in a summary format. So basically, this looks at the same line items we just saw, and what is the fiscal impact of the future growth, residential and non-residential growth under the hybrid scenario in these time periods, years 1 to 5, years 1 to 10, and years 1 to 18. This is to really show that the future growth, the same sort of pattern comes out, that about 90% of the revenues for future growth is also income and property tax, as you'd expect, because we're basing it on the current budget and we're using the current levels of service. As far as the costs are concerned, 63% of the costs, as I mentioned, is for education, and that includes the school system, it includes the community college, it includes the library. So that's considered the education category. The Board of Education itself, the Howard County Public School System, is about 56% of the budget. And this is really just to show you that the methodologies developed to project these costs are important, meaning that because education has such a big impact on the budget, you want to kind of make sure that you're reasonably projecting those forward. And same with the property and income taxes. So this is where the SAC concentrated, the Spending Affordability Advisory Committee concentrated when we met with them to kind of look at these major impact line items. Public safety is 12.3%. And then the fire reserve fund, as I mentioned before, is $152 million. So we projected those costs, all those detailed costs as you see there forward. Okay. So what this chart is, again, it shows the results of the fiscal impacts of the hybrid scenario by each of those line items. And so you can see Howard County Public School System, also future growth is about 51%, over 50% of the budget, et cetera. So in a way, this is this is a good check that we used a marginal analysis, and I'll talk about that in a minute, to protect public schools. And the fact that if you're looking at the new growth, the fact that it comes out about the same percentage shows some validity to the projection assumptions of that moving forward. So revenue assumptions, I'm not going to, there's only 2 slides in these. I don't want to go into a lot of detail because we got a lot of people, but I'm happy to answer questions. Yeah, for sure. So basically this summarizes this. There's 3 main types of methodologies used. One is a marginal approach. Marginal basically means that we want to kind of look at it and figure out a way to apply the methodology to new growth only to try to get to become as accurate as we can. Since income taxes and property taxes are the greatest source, it's important to really look at those, and we spent some detail on those. The other 10% often use a per capita or employee approach. An example would be you might have a cost for service, like you pay for a service. So usually people pay services. So as the population increases, what's the current population? What's the current per capita, service cost or service revenue? I'm sorry, and then you apply that moving forward. And then we also used a marginal approach for the one-time capital revenues. It's like road excise tax. It's pretty straightforward. We know what the road excise tax is. It's a certain amount per square foot. We calculate new square feet being built as new houses and commercial space gets built, and just apply that tax to it. Same with the school surcharge. The transfer and recordation taxes are based on the valuation, so those are also marginal. Costs, same type of thing. Marginal approach for schools for both operating and capital, since those are big parts of the budget. So an example of that is we basically estimate how many students are in each house by house type, by each planning area, receive that information from the school system, the student yields, apply the student yields per house, multiply times the current cost per student that's in the current FY23 budget. And same with capital. We know the cost to build particular schools, how many seats per school, and then you just you calculate that moving forward. We know what the county typically spends on debt service versus pay-as-you-go, and that's all built into the model. For public safety, it's a little different. We do use calls for service, meaning that the police and fire calls for service, they give us the records so we know where all the calls were held. And so like retail, for example, has a lot more activity, so they have a proportionally higher level of police and fire need than would be like an office setting, for example. And then there's per capita cost and service. So that might be, for example, parks. You have the park budget divided by the current park population, and you assume that that carries forward into the future. So with the SAC, the Spending Affordability Advisory Committee, when we presented these detailed methodologies, they suggested some changes. And these 2 charts highlight those changes. So the original model actually showed that the net revenues were $52 million. So we revised the model, and now it's $58 million. Of course, that includes inflation, so that's one of the major reasons. Actually, if we didn't include inflation, through the SAC process, which took sort of a conservative approach, we lowered the net fiscal impacts to $43 million. or they were lowered. I wouldn't say we lowered it. Just through these assumption changes. You kind of see these changes here. I'll talk about one of them, not go into a lot of detail. But for example, for the income tax methodology, we assumed mortgage rate of 5% because we were working on this in the summer, fall of last year. Mortgage rates were 5%, but the economy changed, and now they're 6.5% or higher. So when we met with the SAC, we said, let's increase mortgage rates. And what that does is if the mortgage rates are higher, it requires a greater income to buy a house. So it actually, from a fiscal perspective, it presumes more income tax coming in. Now that assumes that if mortgage rates don't increase, the value of the homes don't correspondingly go down. There's an argument to be made for that. But I don't think that's happening in Howard County because the demand is so strong. In general, housing has stayed about the same, housing prices, despite the fact that mortgage rates are going up. So there's other various assumptions that we used here, and it changed the results. And we also wanted to include, the SAC recommended including inflation to get the nominal value. This really came up in the context of Blueprint. Blueprint Maryland came up. So we wanted to show the nominal impact, what's the actual budget into the future, because that's the way the world works, of what the actual revenues would be. And so you can see with the 2.5% inflation rate, you end up with the $59 million. So why does growth that generate net positive revenues. So these are some of the main reasons. New homes are larger and more expensive for all home types. New homes are assessed at a higher value typically, so you need a greater income to move into new housing. Also, new construction pays a significant amount of one-time revenues when built. So this is an example. I mentioned this before. So a new 28,000 square foot, $500,000 dollar home, which is probably low, actually. I think so. Which is an exact could be probably 800 or 900,000.
Probably $1 million now.
Exactly. Yeah. So it would be a lot higher than what you're seeing here. So the school surcharge is $750 per square foot. So it's $21,000. It had been, as you know, $1.5 per square foot, and it's moved up. Road excise tax is a certain dollar per square foot. Transfer tax is based on 1%, or I think it's 1.25% now. And then the recordation tax, which is based on $500 per $500 of assessed value. So a new home built in the county would pay a one-time amount to the county of about $34,000. What's not included here is MIHU fees. So if you were to do a fee in lieu for a single-family detached, you would probably add another, $20,000 or $30,000 to that. So those one-time revenues, as they come in as new homes are built, are part of the fiscal structure of the county's budget. So basically, those are added to the county, and that's one reason why, new growth is positive in Howard County. And of course, non-residential is a contributor to the positive fiscal impacts through property taxes, and service levels are lower. So you don't have, people, school children living in these, unlike residential. So the costs are lower, but you still get the property tax benefit from the non-residential. Oftentimes you hear that you want non-residential and not residential. Well, in Howard County, residential actually isn't too bad from a fiscal perspective, and it's unique in Howard, and actually all counties in Maryland, because we have a local income tax. Most counties in the U.S. don't have a local income tax, so that helps quite a bit. For example, I used to do these. That's why I continue to do these, I suppose, in my previous job. And we had, as a consultant, working in Scottsdale, Arizona. And the way their budget was set up, 60% of the revenues came from retail sales tax, local retail sales tax. So commercial was what they wanted. And housing actually generated negative results. In Dublin, Ohio is another example. They actually had a local income tax, which is just outside of Columbus. They have a local income tax, but it's by place of work. So if you have an office building in Dublin, Ohio, then the city of Dublin, Ohio received a local income tax from the office space. So Dublin wanted a lot of office space. They don't care where people live. They just wanted the office, right? So it really depends on the fiscal structure of the counties and the jurisdiction. In Maryland, we happen to have a local income tax, which really helps the fiscal structure for residential. So some conclusions on this results. New growth, the number one conclusion, new growth does generate positive fiscal impacts based on the current level of service. Largest revenues, as we talked about, are property and income tax. One-time revenues from new growth are also very important. The school surcharge, road excise tax, transfer and recordation taxes. Schools, capital and operating are the most significant costs. Challenges ahead is that we have an increasing need to maintain and rebuild existing infrastructure. Howard County is 40, 50, 60, modern Howard County is 40, 50, 60 years old. It really started developing in the 50s. So a lot of the infrastructure is now, a lot of the school buildings are now, 40, 50, 60 years old. And we all know these challenges, that we have limited capital dollars, and the capital dollars, it's always a balance to how do we spend capital dollars on new schools that we need, or also rebuilding existing schools and also bringing them up to current levels of service. So that will continue moving forward. One way to think about this is that new growth generates positive fiscal results. That additional money could be used to help rehab older schools. That's one way to think about it. But it's also something that you really need to think about too, because we do know that the growth in the county is slowing. It will slow. And of course, if you have this new general plan adopted and the zoning changed, we will create redevelopment opportunities, but that will take time. So it's a question of when that happens and how that happens, right? And the concept that growth is built into the fiscal structure of the county is very important. And it makes sense that it's built into the fiscal structure of the county because the county has been growing for 40 or 50 years. So the modern normal Howard County is that we're a growing community, just like other communities in the Baltimore, Washington, other large metropolitan areas. So the budgets are sort of designed over time through legislation over decades to take advantage of that. So you have excise taxes, you have school surcharges, you increase those over time or change those over time. So it's not a value judgment. It's better it's not, one's not better than the other. It's just the reality is that growth is built into the fiscal structure. If growth stops, then that will have to change. And you either reduce levels of service, or you raise taxes, or there's other things that will need to be looked at. So the intent of HOCO by design really isn't to grow for the sake of growth because we have a fiscal need for it. It really is with growth because we have the demand, and people and the government doesn't have a lot of control over that much anyways. The private sector sort of sets that demand as well as the supply. But and there's a market for it. And so I guess just something to keep in mind is that you hear the argument that we're growing because we need the money. Well, I would say that we're growing because that's just what happens in a very market demand driven metropolitan area. We have the fiscal reality of where the budget is, and we need to kind of consider that moving forward as we change into a redevelopment community compared to a community that's been largely built on greenfield, which is changing. And that's not new. That's really been a transition that's occurred probably over the last, certainly since 2010 and the beginning in the 2000 general plan. So.
All right, thank you. So we only have about 15 minutes for questions, which
Okay.
means that I'm sure you'll be back. We'll need you back.
Okay.
To continue because we have zoning board at 1:00. So, at 1:30.
Is it? 1:30, yes.
Okay. Well,
It'd be
then
nice to
we
have
should.
time for lunch and to review the
Yes.
materials before the zoning board, so.
So, is the preference to end at 12:30? Could we go to 12:45 to give 45 minutes of a break
I
period?
would like to end at 12:30, but that's,
You're fine at 12:30.
I don't.
Yeah, either way, we have to
another
come back.
15 minutes
Yeah.
today, yeah.
Okay, so we'll end at 12:30.
Great.
All right, in that case, does anyone, all right, Mr. Youngman.
Did you guys model any other growth scenarios, or did you only model the ultimate hybrid model?
We did model. We modeled the 4 other growth scenarios that we showed before.
Oh,
Yeah.
really?
Yeah, and we have details on that. It's on the HOCO by design website.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And those probably weren't tweaked with spending affordabilities changes, but they're at least all consistent relative to each other, same methodology.
Exactly, yes. Yeah.
Okay. What drove the sort of allocation to 50% rental apartments of the 25,000 sort of projected?
Really, it's a result of the flume. There's not much single-family detached land left in the county. And so HOCO by design, as we talked about earlier, the intent of the future growth really is to concentrate most of it in these redevelopment activity centers. And so you build, in those centers you have apartments, rental apartments and condos. You can put single-family detached homes in those areas.
I'm talking about the rental apartment specifically, like we're at 50% rental apartment, we're at 10% condo.
Oh, that was just
I mean, the building takes up the same space.
Right, okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, so the, in the fiscal, at least, we modeled it at 10% condo. And what drove that was looking at what's happening now, basically. So most new multifamily housing is rental. There's very few condominiums being built. Now, if the market were to be changed, we can certainly look at the difference and make it 50% condo and 50% rental. But I don't think the market is that way currently.
And there's nothing stopping us from referencing that priority in a general plan, is there?
Well, I
We
guess I
can't
go back to
force
what.
people to do things, but,
Right.
at some point, if we say, look, the allocation of this multifamily, let's say it's 13 plus 2,500, so it's, 60%. We want 1/3 of that, or we desire for 1/3 of that to be ownership units, even in the multifamily, then that at least is a guidance, something that's in the document. We could do that. I guess we can do whatever we want. I'll lead to the next person, since we only have 15 minutes.
So just to confirm, essentially, because Mr. Youngman's going in a direction that I was headed, which, and confirming this to begin would really help my question. So you said that growth in the county is slowing, but that's really because we're forcing it to slow. It's not that if there were no constraints, that it would be slowing.
I think it's slowing for two reasons. One is that when you say forcing it, I'm presuming you're referring to APFO?
Well, just that
Or-
we're
or
using
so-
policy tools to slow it down.
Right, so based on current zoning, so
It's okay
if
with
you
the short
were to
answer.
rezone things to make it allowable for higher density housing, then you could fill a demand, exactly. So
Because
it is a combination of that.
We could incentivize
Mm-hmm.
ownership units. We could incentivize sort of the right growth in the right places to be the right solution for our challenges.
Mm-hmm.
That is an option available to us.
Do you know what it does to the financial model? I mean, on a condo versus you're not,
Excellent question, Mr. Youngman.
Yes.
That's the question you have condo and apartment as the same for the property tax and income.
Right, yeah, actually, trying to think about this. So the way the property tax works for the rental income, the state assessment department they use what's called a market capitalization rate. So that is a little bit different. It's based on the rental. So we looked at average rents, and then based on the average rents and a capitalization rate, what is the assessed value, and that translates into property tax.
So I want to focus on condos, and I specifically want to focus on the Ellicott City ones, just because they're in the middle of the pack when you look at the prices between the different areas that you sort of subdivided through. Can you confirm for me that on a single-family detached property in Ellicott City, that the property tax annually is $12,648?
So are you basing it on page 4 there, where it says that the assessed value is $854,000?
And then you
okay.
have the monthly property tax, and then I multiplied
Right.
the monthly property tax by 12.
Yeah, so I think if you multiply the tax rate, which I think is 1.04 for the general fund, and it's something for the fire fund, that's how you would get that number, that 12,000. I don't know, it sounds reasonable to me, the $12,000, yeah.
And then the annual income tax would be $4,824,000 for that same property.
Is that based on the, yeah,
At the bottom, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then that gets you to a total of about $17,472. But then for condos in Ellicott City, you have that they're $441 a month. So I made that.
I don't know where you're seeing the 441, but,
Let me get back up here. It's in your in the methodologies and assumptions.
okay.
Also, just so everybody in the public knows, on page 23, there's also the student yields, which I think are really important. But essentially, if you take the condo costs, multiply them annually, then you also have your annual income tax. If you took that single-family detached home, instead transferred it into those 4 condo units, your total would be $28,624 compared to the single-family detached revenue of $17,472. And then when you're talking about student yields, we're getting much less students when it comes to condos and one-bedroom units than we are single-family detached homes. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Because then, what I did is I went back through the superintendent's proposed to actual over the last 5 years. And I took out 2019 because the superintendent requested 594 million, and the executive at that time approved 600,000. But in every subsequent year, there's a significant increase on what's requested. But the average is actually about $60 million. So you're very close to meeting what the school system has said their fiscal needs are year over year in terms of what you're projecting for these annuals. And I don't know if you did that intentionally, but for me, I've been trying to work backwards from the operating budget numbers to get to what that annual is to then figure out how. The question that I'm just going to put a pin for like the next time that we come back is if we can get more specific on what those goals are, because we have no, for housing, you know, how could we drive more of that property tax revenue and income tax revenue without burdening our system? So making sure that we're providing housing for our teachers and our paraeducators without overburdening the school system. And having those goals of getting to X many one-bedroom units versus, you know, continuing this trend of sprawling single-family detached developments that send many children to our wonderful education system, I think would be really helpful for the next time we pick up.
Yeah, that's quite under that.
Did you mean 60 million or 600 million, Ms. Rigby?
60 million. 60 million is the average superintendent requested amount over what has been funded.
Okay, over. Got you. Okay, thank you.
Yes. So I just want to put that pin in your ear for the next time.
Right. Well, that would be quite an analysis. So just as a summary,
And I do recognize you've already gone through and figured out where every child in this school system is coming from, the type of unit that they're coming from, the property, I really appreciate it, but figuring out how we can get to these goals versus just limit, I don't know. It's a different way that we've approached this, but I think the time is right to solve some of our issues using the tools that we have.
Right. Yeah, so I think what you're talking about is a prototype analysis where you look at the fiscal impacts of individual land use prototypes. So those are very hard to do because it all depends on the details. And
Right.
things aren't, you can't really do averages with those, I don't think, because then it's just difficult to show. There was a prototype analysis conducted by Urban Analytics that was presented to the SAC back in 2019.
Okay.
So the SAC at that time wanted to do an analysis based on what the impact of the recent Apfo changes were to be. And so I did pull that, and that's available. We can certainly get that to you.
Thank you.
And Urban Analytics, another fiscal impact, or it's a economic consulting firm. But for example, they did show, like an SFD had a net operating surplus. These are all costs minus revenues of about $5,000 per year. SFAs were $3,500. Rentals were $941, and condos were $4,000.
I would love to go through
So
the prototype. That'd
that
be helpful.
what you're talking about actually has been done.
Even
Now,
better.
not quite where you take one house and that was one single family detached. What's the difference between that and putting in, 3 condos in that house as sort of the missing concept?
Right, well, essentially,
That'd be sort of a
'cause-
different sort of exercise, but I would suggest looking at the
Okay.
Urban Analytics, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Ms. Young? Are you holding for next time?
I'm voting for next time.
All right. Mr. Youngman?
Can we get, for next time, do you have a map or anything that shows areas that were designated for employment that are now being designated for either residential or at least mixed use with some amount of residential, and vice versa? Stuff, areas that were, where I'm going with it?
Yeah,
Sort
I
of
think we
that
could do-
high-level
Yeah,
shift in
yeah.
land use.
Right,
That's all.
okay.
Dr. Jones? I can't see you, so I just want to make sure.
Yeah, no, I'm good. I'm good for now. Thank you.
Thank you. But I think I'll just close with one of the positives of today's session is that there really seems to be a lot of alignment among the policymakers that we do want more ownership opportunities available for residents and ones that they're able to afford.
Agreed. I think we all agree
We
on that.
all agree on that.
We all agree on that, and I would also be thinking something, there's not enough in this plan.
All right. Well, that's not, we'd love to hear it.
Yes.
So I think that that's certainly something that, just pulling that out today, I really, I think it's great that we have alignment there, and I think that that's something that we'll certainly be following up. Recognizing that some of those policy incentives are really following the general plan and comprehensive rezoning and zoning regulations, and then additional programs that we can do to really incentivize the ownership opportunities that we're all seeking. So, all right, well, with that, we'll end with 2 minutes early since we'll all be together again. Well, we won't. Thank you, Ms. Gowan. Thank you, Director Gowan. We wish you.
Thank you for everything you have done. It's not been an easy ride. And you did most of it during COVID,
A lot of it, yes.
all of it.
Oh, on that note,
Well, I don't know.
Take care.
It will be easier than Howard County, but there you go.
Well, I would like to say thank you, all of you, for your partnership over the years and your support. You're always very accessible to me and available in, working through issues together, and I really appreciate the collaboration. I'll miss it.
Okay, I'm going to cry. Shut it down.
all right. You heard it. Shut it down now. We're going to cry. We are adjourned.